All right, guys, Anthony Bedomo here with Austin Historical Weapons Guild at our new home, Vigilante. Here with Joshua. Today we're talking about Lignitzer's play number 4. So this is working from the middle how or the middle strike. And the first thing as we start looking at this more is he says do I think it's a twer or a zwerk from the strike, which means a cross, which doesn't mean a whole lot until you actually know longsword. And as Lignitzer was of the time of Lichtenauer, and I believe a member of the Society of Lichtenauer, it would make sense that you could use this phrase or word to use the same thing. So instead of these, I'm going to grab a longsword real quick. And in case you haven't watched the longsword Zwerkau video, a quick primer on Zwerkau. So Zwerkau is described as hands are high, using the back edge of the sword from your right side, bring the sword across. Generally speaking, high. You can strike it low, but either way, your hands are shown as being high. When you're coming from your left side, using the long edge, same thing, come high, come low. In either of those instances, you want your hand high, and you're trying to make the sword come across the line and working the angle from there. It can be a strike by itself, you can use displace and attack, but understanding what a Zwerkau is or a Twerhau is going to be really important to knowing how to interpret, understand this play. And notice this is different than a Mittelhau, which would be a long edge from the right side. And generally speaking, you can come across the chest, you can come across high, but a Zwerkau, really think about keeping those hands high, and again, using that back edge, getting that thumb on the blade, and kind of working from there. So with that understanding, with that concept, back to Lignitzer's Rule 4. So like before, we're going to assume in the same distance that this cut is not supposed to strike my target, but instead coming in, working from the bind. Things that I'm kind of assuming and kind of working for beyond that is that I'm going to keep my buckler here covering my hand. I'm not doing anything like this, but I'm keeping everything a little bit shorter so I can use my buckler to keep myself safe and moving through there. So we have a couple different options for this that I kind of want to talk through. I'll start with my preferred one, why I feel it works a little bit better, but we will talk about one or two others as well, just to kind of highlight options. This play, as it's written, is very open-ended, and there's definitely a lot of interpretation out there that could be equally right or this, but there's definitely one that I feel works a lot better and fits in with the rest of Lignitzer's plays so far and kind of the dialogue and methodology he's presenting. So again, starting off, if he's in a guard position, whatever, I'm coming in with my middle how. I'm looking for this bind. So my first Twerhau or Zwerk is I'm going to leave my thumb on the blade, coming from the left side, cutting into the head, driving with this attack here. He's probably going to step this aside, put it away, something like that, which is fine. My second Zwerkau isn't really to strike or attack, but instead to help lock him out and really open him up. So I can make that Scheitelhau, that vertical strike, come down the center very easily. And again, if they come up high, I'm able to parry. I pull this down, thrust low, thrusting back up the center if I even wanted to, and kind of working from there. So again, from the top, nice and slow, I enter with my middle how, my middle strike, to play off of this. And working from this bind connection here, I'm going to cross strike. Notice hand is going high. I'm bringing that long edge across from the outside, striking at the head. As he places this off, I'm going to continue this attack to the same side, mainly to it's going to protect myself. He doesn't have an attack at me anymore, whereas here he did as he deflected this. This is open. Here, I pick up his sword and threaten him, so I keep him locked to my right side, which opens up the vertical Scheitelhau. From here, that's forcing him to go high to make that cover, right? If he tries to come across from that low position, he's not going to get there in time if the sword comes in, so he's going across and high, which lets me pull and then strike in that thrust, working from that position. So again, this is open interpretations. There's not a lot of variety or examples or why I think that one's better. So here's a few other things we talked about, we looked at that kind of fall into the same category and why it could work. And then we'll talk a little bit about why it doesn't feel as good or as smooth. So one of the main primary examples with this Zwerkau, especially in longsword, is you throw one and come back around with a second. So looking at that with sword and buckler from that same mindset, as I throw my middle house here, I've got two options. I can make a big swing and really bait and make him commit to that. But if you notice, as I'm doing that, even at a moderate speed, right, there's a lot of time for him to kind of press in and collapse on things or just make this unpleasant for me, right? So it should be pretty self-explanatory, self-apparent with any kind of weapon system, especially when we're at a close range where we're within striking distance. You don't want a big wind up behind the head as a general rule, right? Doesn't mean they're bad. If you do it as part of a feint, it's totally applicable and an option. But working from the close range of sword and buckler, trying to create this tempo here. If I bring this out here, he's got a whole tempo to just shut this down early, pressing this out. And even though I'm taking my hand, I've got a lot of bad things starting to happen before my sword is able to re-engage. So that's probably not as useful as you want it to be. If we look at that same side, kind of just in the Meyer sense, doubling through and making a second attack to the same opening, I bring this here and I just double this in. I don't have a whole lot to work from, right? And this could be intentional. This could be very much, I've set this up to then cut behind the same way but we kind of just did this in rule 2, I believe. Yeah, coming around, right? We're kind of just doubling this in through there. So that could be his intention. And as far as the rest of the text goes, if he raises up, so I come here in my middle house, Zwerk, he goes high to stop it. But I don't have a nice line for my Scheitelhau, right? It doesn't really match that option, those plays, because my Scheitelhau kind of gets shut down. It doesn't mean it's bad. As I said, we just saw that similar motions in actually both rules 2 and 3, where you double behind the weapon, set those big opening up to walk across, but it doesn't seem to flow the same way it does for rule 4. So it doesn't really get that Scheitelhau to work. The other option we talked about and discussed is kind of making that second strike come wider across. So instead of looking at this doubling aside and working the outside, if that second strike comes across here, we're running the same issues here where I don't really get a good Scheitelhau strike. It's much easier to close that line. It doesn't commit as high to make those openings happen. So again, it just doesn't feel as nice or as convincing as that first option, which doesn't mean it's incorrect. It doesn't mean it's something Lignitzer wouldn't have done, but it doesn't seem to fall under rule 4. It's kind of just rehashing rules 2 and 3, which we've seen before, working those short lines, and when those fall apart, right here, once this falls apart, I don't have a whole lot with this. Instead of trying to just strike the leg and walking away, which is kind of his other options from those plays. So a couple more times, just so we can see the ones I do like, and what I do believe is a good option, because I know there's been a lot of information just kind of dumped in a torrent. So I come in, I Zwerk from behind his blade, I Zwerk again, locking him outside, which sets up my Scheitelhau. As he goes high to cover himself, I pull back, thrusting in to the lower openings. So once again, a little bit more intensity now. So I strike, cut behind, cut in, vertical, then low. And notice he didn't make it high that time, and his head was super open, super exposed, which I feel like is the intent of that play, right? Something to keep in mind as we start looking at plays that have 4 or more moves to them. I'm never going to put, well, with a training partner, I'm going to pull a strike every time. But when I'm fighting, when we're geared up, when we're looking for that deeper involved free play, if those early strikes happen, make sure you take them. Don't say like, oh, this isn't supposed to hit, so I'm going to stop it short. If this is going to hit, let it hit. So don't train yourself into a set combo where you start coming out like, okay, so I'm going to go here, I do this, I pull this short and thrust through. If this Scheitelhau is going to hit because they haven't gone high enough, let it strike through, let it strike home. So one more time, keeping Joshua safe. Coming with the middle Hau, Zwerk behind the sword, Zwerk to the outside, locking him in place. Scheitelhau comes in, he has to go high to cover that. I pull out, take the lower thrust. So I hope that made sense. I hope you can follow along, and if you don't like our interpretation, don't think it's the correct interpretation of it, I feel it definitely matches the intentions and descriptions of that play. As I said, that one, rule 4, is really open-ended, really open interpretation. But I said the kind of options we went through kind of highlighted my train of thought, how I kind of looked at these things, and settled on the one we chose. So as always, guys, if there are questions or comments, reach out below, comment on Facebook, send us an email, anything like that. There's only 2 more of these left, so if there's something else you guys would like to hear and talk about, whether it's more sword and buckler from another source, or a different weapon that'll fit inside, comment that as well. Let me know what you'd like to see, and I'll be happy to make that happen. Wednesday will be another Fabris video, starting to work through that, and then Friday we'll have more longsword. Thanks again, guys. Have a good night.